Okay. We should be live any moment now. Okay. I think we're going. Nice. Hi everybody. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I'm a PhD candidate for now at the University of Pennsylvania. And I have a few. And I study anxiety and addiction, specifically trying to map out some of the neurophysiology of anxiety through the lens of addiction. And so I have a few studies that I like to talk about before we go to the live conversation that struck me as being pretty interesting over the past week, 3 in particular. And they probably stuck out to me because I have an 8-month-old daughter who's growing up so fast it's frankly giving me whiplash. But what I think it's also done, at least for me, is think a lot about my experiences growing up, sort of in preparation, at least in part, for what her experience may or may not be like while she grows up. So let's begin. So there's a study that came out that focused on one of the things that disproportionately, unfairly, unhealthfully, but authentically plagues the lives of adolescents in school, being popular and being liked. And so this was a study out of a collaboration between Florida Atlantic University and the University of Montreal. And so the overall story is that prior research had identified 2 broad categories of popular adolescents, popular teens: aggressive and pro-social. And so the pro-social contingent were unique in that they gained and maintained their popularity via social cooperation, and were more socially well-adjusted. But this research suggests that there might be a third group, a third category of popular students or popular teens that they refer to as bistrategic or Machiavellian. And they exhibit features of the other 2 categories, pro-social and aggressive, but not as strong as either. And this actually ended up comporting with the perceptions of current teens, their perspectives on popularity. Teens obviously care quite a bit about popularity, but they're aware of a difference between being liked and being popular. And despite that, they will oftentimes select popularity over being liked. So to step back before we get to the findings of this recent study. So there were two groups had been identified, once again, that differentiate each other, different groups of popular teens, again, the aggressive and the pro-social. And the aggressive contingent will acquire and maintain their popularity through coercion and aggressive behavior, no surprises there. And then as this team of researchers were evaluating or taking surveys of teens, current adolescents, they would describe a third group that they would call being the most popular and loved. And this is sort of what tipped them off to having a sort of Machiavellian-like feature to this group. And so, so this study really highlights, mostly focuses on that third group, that bistrategic or Machiavellian group. And so they had the highest level of popularity and were above average on physical and relational aggression, as well as pro-social behavior. And they tended to be viewed by other teens in their social cohort as being disruptive and angry, but otherwise well-adjusted. And so Brett Larson, I believe is how you pronounce his name, he's a professor of psychology at Florida Atlantic University. He says, quote, "Bistrategic adolescents are noteworthy not only for their very high levels of popularity, but also for the way they balance getting their way with getting along." And then another quote, "They were less pro-social than the pro-social popular adolescents, but at the same time less physically and relationally aggressive than the aggressive popular adolescents. These youth are truly Machiavellian, maintaining their popularity by offsetting the coercive behavior required to maintain power with carefully calibrated acts of kindness." And so the pro-social popular teens were well-liked and well-adjusted, and aggressive popular adolescents were neither. And so another quote from Larson, "Pro-social popular adolescents are well-adjusted, while aggressive popular adolescents are troubled on many fronts. The prognosis for bistrategic popular youth is mixed. Their well-adjusted social and emotional profile, coupled with a moderate propensity for social dominance and rule-breaking, may prove good or bad depending on the environment, thus providing hope for the positive long-term adjustment and concern for the same." And so they're speaking to psychiatric or social issues that once out of high school, once people grow out of adolescence, can encounter, because of course high school is not quite a recapitulation of the experiences of adulthood. And so I mean, this probably strikes a lot of teens as unsurprising. I don't know that it necessarily directly comports with my experience in high school, but I probably wasn't looking at society or the social interactions through this kind of categorical lens or this lens of categories. And so it'll be interesting to see how my 8-month-old, so it's going to be a little while before she's in adolescence, what her experiences are like going through school. And given the fact that the pro-social category of adolescents tended to exhibit the best adjustment, or they were the most well-adjusted as they grew up, is perhaps indicative of a kind of rearing that might facilitate happiness for the youth as they're an adolescent, but then also as they get older. Okay. So the next study stood out to me because we've been taking our 8-month-old to one of the parks. I'm in Philadelphia, and there's many parks in the area, and so we take her to a park on basically a daily basis. My wife right now is taking the baby to a park right nearby, and so of course we put down a blanket for the baby to crawl on, but she inevitably escapes the bounds of the blanket. Like, she's on a mission. It's like priority number one is to get off this blanket. And all of a sudden, she's entered the wild world of microbes that inhabit, the floor of a heavily trafficked park. And so the question that a lot of parents ask themselves is just how clean they want to keep their babies' environments. What are the trade-offs to letting them get dirty beyond just increasing how much laundry the parents have to do? And, she's had her vaccines, but who knows what little beasties are living in a park that's used by tons of people and animals and so on, right? And so a recent study helped to assuage our concerns, at least a little bit, justifying letting our kids play in the dirt a bit. And so this is a study out of the University of Colorado at Boulder, and the summary of the story is that they were able to identify a fatty acid that's found in a bacterium that lives in soil. The bacterium is called Mycobacterium vaccae. I believe that's how you pronounce that, that last name, Vaccae. And so this fatty acid from that bacterium inhibits immunological pathways that drive inflammatory signaling, increasing resilience to stress. And this sort of leads the researchers to foresee a microbe-based stress vaccine. And so I don't know if I'm all the way there yet regarding the vaccine, but there's an interesting evolutionary story to entertain here as we move through this study. So we'll get there in a sec. So back in 1989, scientists established the concept of the hygiene hypothesis, to explain, increased exposure to microorganisms that might actually be beneficial. And so this was from David Strachan, who pioneered the concept, suggesting that sterilizing our environment, eradicating the microorganisms to which we're exposed in childhood, may actually be leading to impaired immune systems and higher rates of allergies and asthma. And so, since the late 1980s, the theory has been built upon, suggesting that it's not just the absence of all microorganisms that's a problem, but rather it's the absence of beneficial microbes that are also eliminated by that same sort of sterilization effort. And so Jay Weldon says, I played in the dirt growing up and turned out just fine. Yeah, I mean, I think that is an instinct of a lot of parents. It's certainly an instinct that I have, because I did the same. But, then again, increased hygiene or improved hygiene is in part responsible to a large degree responsible for the extended lifespan that we all enjoy. And so there's clearly a trade-off here. And so the hygiene hypothesis has been built upon, refining it to be more focused on the problem being that we're eliminating beneficial microbes by overly sterilizing the environments of kids. And so Christopher Lowry, who's the senior author and professor of physiology, senior author of this study and professor of physiology, he says, quote, "The idea is that as humans have moved away from farms and an agricultural or hunter-gatherer existence into cities, we have lost contact with organisms that serve to regulate our immune system and suppress inappropriate inflammation. That has put us at risk for inflammatory disease and stress-related psychiatric disorders." And so Christopher Lowry he's published a bunch of studies on this sort of theme, showing links between exposure to healthy bacteria and mental health specifically. And so children raised in rural environments surrounded by animals and sort of dust rich with bacteria they tend to have more stress-resilient immune systems and may also be more resistant to mental illness than pet-free city dwellers. And so, of course, a lot of that is correlative, not necessarily causative. Who's to say that the sort of social environment or just the environment in general beyond the microbial environment might play a significant role in determining whether or not people growing up in rural settings have more or less mental illness. And so there were a couple what we call preclinical studies or animal studies to evaluate the effects of this bacterium in particular that they were honing in on, again, Mycobacterium vaccae. And so when that bacterium is injected into rodents, it alters rodent behavior in a way that's reminiscent of antidepressants. And it also had persistent anti-inflammatory effects in the brain. And then even further, when they injected the microbe prior to a significant stressor, like environmental stressor in mice, they could prevent the long-term effects of that stressor. Interesting finding might suggest that there might be some benefit to either the microbe itself, the bacterium itself, or whatever it is that the microbe might be doing to the immune system in confronting conditions like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But this study went a little bit further than that, and they isolated a specific lipid from the bacterium. The name is, 10Z-hexadecanoic acid. Who cares what the name of it's just a fat, okay? Think of it as just a fat. Using next-gen sequencing to evaluate its interactions with stimulated macrophages. And so macrophages are an immune system cell. They're sort of like one of the earliest foot soldiers that'll encounter any pathogen that might infect you. They recognize it as different, they gobble it up via a process called phagocytosis, and then they chop it up and display it on the surface of the cell for then eventually B cells and T cells to be able to specifically attack. Okay, so once inside the cells, this lipid, again, that hexadecanoic acid, acted in a lock and key fashion, right? So it bound to a specific receptor, PPAR, which then inhibits a whole bunch of inflammatory pathways. And so these PPARs, are nuclear receptors. So they're receptors on the nucleus inside of cells that operate as transcription factors to regulate the expression of a variety of genes, right? And so it's not just immune system signaling, it's things like cell differentiation, metabolism, and, metabolism meaning like what happens to fats, proteins, and carbs when you eat them, and then eventually they get exposed to cells. And then, but importantly also, immunological processes. And so, again, another quote from Christopher Lowry, that senior author. It seems that these bacteria we co-evolved with have a trick up their sleeve. When they get taken up by immune cells, they release these lipids that bind to the receptor and shut off the inflammatory cascade. So that's a pretty cool byproduct of evolution, potential byproduct of evolution. But the way that Lowry phrases this might be slightly misleading, though I'm sure from his perspective completely unintentionally. It's not that the bacterium decided to have a card up its sleeve. Rather, the only way that it could have possibly evolved to have this kind of a relationship or to live in or on us is it had to have the capability to evade our immune systems. We're exposed to a huge number of microbes all the time. And our ancestors were exposed to quite a bit more than we are today, quite likely. And they had the opportunity to use, these microbes had the opportunity to use our bodies sort of like fish use a coral reef, living in them and on them. But the only microbes that are capable of doing so without our immune systems immediately attacking them were the ones that were able to develop some kind of biochemical tool that enabled them to evade our immune systems. Our immune system didn't just attack them and get rid of them. And so this team may have identified how it was that this microbe in particular, Mycobacterium vaccae, was successful in doing so. But beyond that, it may be that this very same evolutionary feature that enabled them to use us as their coral reefs may be beneficial for us because it produces something that inhibits our immune system, our immune response to them, and in doing so, inhibits an immune response that over time causes us to develop certain maladies like, chronic stress or anxiety or who knows, irritable bowel syndrome or anything that's related to some kind of nonspecific inflammation. Okay, and so one last quote from Professor Lowry. This is just one strain of one species of one type of bacterium that is found in the soil, but there are millions of other strains in soils. We are just beginning to see the tip of the iceberg in terms of identifying the mechanisms through which they have evolved to keep us all healthy. It should inspire awe in all of us, which is a nice, cute little bow to tie on it. And listen, I agree. I mean, I think this is really exciting research, and dirt, it's just one environment in which microbes can develop. There may be other environments that might be beneficial, but then also disadvantageous to expose a baby to. But suffice it to say that now when we're in the park, we're going to let her touch the dirt a little bit more. All right, so there was one last study, and this is less relevant to us today than it was about 8 months ago when our baby was born. And so it's about the advantages and disadvantages of having a C-section to give birth. And so, of course, sometimes, very frequently, there's really no alternative, and the downsides of not having a C-section dramatically outweigh the upsides of attempting a vaginal birth. But, nobody really tells you this until you're there. There are moments, and they're really short moments where a decision can be made by really the mother who's in labor, but then also the father or any kind of advocate who's in the room with the person giving birth, as to whether or not she wants to keep pushing as hard as she can, or if she'd like to transition to a C-section. And we had this kind of decision point, and after a certain point, the physicians in the room will just say, "Listen, we have to do a C-section. There is no decision to be made." But we could have made the decision to do a C-section earlier, and she ended up being able to give birth without a C-section. But we were very close to that hard stop. And so it's interesting to keep in mind, and just FYI, this can happen. So there has been a large body of evidence that's been growing that shows pretty substantial differences in the microbiomes of babies that are born vaginally compared to those that are born by C-section. But most of that evidence focuses on the external microbiomes. And so if you're not familiar with the term microbiome, it basically refers to the collective population of microbes, including fungi, bacteria, viruses, and so on, right? All the microbes that live in and on the human body. And so we all have microbiomes that are uniquely our own, and they're influenced by everything from what we eat, to what kind of soap we use, to where we live, to how sweaty we get every day, but then also our genetic heritage, right? And so importantly, there's plenty of evidence that your microbiome isn't just something that makes you uniquely you, right? It's not just like some kind of interesting quirk about being human, but it can influence things like predispositions to obesity, diabetes, how you absorb vitamins, and quite likely psychiatric conditions as well. And so the finding of this study was that C-section babies have different gut bacteria compared to babies that are born vaginally. And I want to highlight gut bacteria, right? So it's not just the microbes that inhabit their skin or their eyes or things on the outside of their body, right? Although some would argue that the gut is still outside your body. But so this was a study that was done at University College London in London, and it was published in Nature, which is a highly regarded journal. And so and the crux is that the way that babies are delivered seems to play a significant role in determining which microbes will tend to colonize a person's gut, okay? And so, importantly, this is the most comprehensive evaluation of microbiomes of babies to this day. And so, one of the findings was that babies that are born by C-section not only tend to have lower levels of gut bacteria that have been identified as potentially advantageous, so good to have, but also tend to have an increased number of pathogens that tend to be associated with hospital environments, right? And so a hospital is obviously a unique environment. It's not like your home. There's a lot of sterilizing that goes on. They use specific antimicrobial soaps. And so this is potentially meaningful. And so this was a study of 596 babies. That's a lot. Specifically stool samples from these babies. And of course, this was in British hospitals. And so the study included 314 babies that were born vaginally and 282 babies that were born by C-section. And they took stool samples several times, 4, 7, 21 days after birth, and then later on in infancy. And then they also evaluated 175 mothers to figure out what the origins of some of these microbes might be. To make, is this from the mother? Is it from the hospital environment? And so they found that babies that were born by C-section had lower numbers of bacteroids, right? And so that's sort of like a category of microbes that can be found in our microbiome. But they had lower numbers of bacteroids that have been identified or characterized as being good to have, and also had increases in opportunistic pathogens, right, that we were talking about earlier, things like Enterococcus, Enterobacter, Klebsiella, and others as well that have been identified as like these are opportunistic or pathogens that will exploit a weakness, essentially a biological opening to colonize. And so right, and so this is the first study that shows that newborns' intestines are colonized differently according to birth method. But it also appears that the environment in which infants are born immediately begins to influence their intestinal microbiomes. So it's not just the mother necessarily, it's like where the baby's hanging out after it's born. And so it still remains unclear how the colonization by antimicrobial resistant opportunistic pathogens, right, those bad to have microbes, might occur in C-section babies, like what it is precisely that distinguishes the experience of a C-section baby from a vaginally born baby. But it is pretty meaningful, and I know there are some interesting studies going on, sort of solutions to these distinctions, right? It's been known that the microbiomes of their skin, of their eyes, can be different. And so there will be some delivery groups who will literally take samples of the vaginal microbiome and basically like colonize the baby with it if it was born by C-section. But so it's still kind of early days here for like, okay, what does this mean down the road? I don't know if they're planning on following these babies that were born by C-section versus vaginally. But one hopes that they do, and if they don't, some other group might do a longitudinal study to see, okay, so we know that they have these different microbiomes. Now, just how practically important is that for their health outcomes later on in life, right? Do some of them develop a greater propensity for addiction? Some of these C-section babies have a greater or lower propensity for obesity, addiction, or psychiatric conditions, depression, PTSD, because we know microbiome research has shown, again, connections between certain microbial colonies in the microbiome in the gut and predispositions to psychiatric conditions. So can it be determined this early, right? Is a C-section versus a vaginal birth what can make a huge difference in steering the developmental trajectory of a person? So cool stuff. Of course, you don't always have the opportunity to just decide that you want, to avoid a C-section. But it's, more knowledge is power, right? So more information in those, very brief moments can help to, inform those decisions. All right. So that's what I have prepared for today. So let's get on to the live conversation. Hello, everyone. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I'm a PhD candidate for now at the University of Pennsylvania. I study anxiety. I study the neurophysiology of anxiety and addiction, specifically trying to map out which of our 86 billion neurons and trillions, hundreds of trillions of synaptic connections between them are responsible for anxiety, pathological anxiety, and addiction. So I talked about 3 stories. One, and these have nothing to do with the fact that I have an 8-month-old daughter. One is what it is that distinguishes different types of popular adolescents. What are their strategies? And are they associated with outcomes later on in life, social outcomes? Number 2, playing in the dirt. Should you let your babies play in the dirt? And if you should or should not, just how much should you? And then 3, the differences in the gut microbiomes between babies that were born vaginally versus babies that were born by C-section. So you can check out the YouTube that I do just by going to Ian McLaughlin Neuroscience probably, and let me know what you think. All right, mud pies are everything. Good to see you. Are you going to Neuroscience 2019 in Illinois? I am not. So I went last year. Yeah, I went last year and the year before. And I already presented the research that I am now, resubmitting for publication. And so there are members of my lab that are going to be going. I went alone both those other times. So it's usually a little bit more fun to go to. So what we're talking about here is Society for Neuroscience. It's the biggest conference of neuroscientists in the world. It's, in fact, one of the biggest conferences, biomedical conferences in the world just in general. It may be the biggest now. It used to be second to cardiovascular. And basically what happens is a huge swarm of neuroscientists descend upon the city and basically just take it over. And oftentimes it's in Washington, D.C., San Diego, Chicago, where it is this upcoming year. And sometimes New Orleans. So I will not be there this year, but I will be there in spirit. Society for Neuroscience is really, really awesome. You get to meet a ton of people that are doing super interesting things, and you take way more notes than you know what to do with. But it is awesome. Okay, when can maybe a vote for you in the Shorty Award? I don't know if I don't think I'm nominated this year or this cycle in the Shorty Awards, but I should keep my eyes out for that. Thank you very much for reminding me. All right. My game is about to start, right? Well, you can have us both on, but I understand people like sports. Hello. Can the brain really change? How does neuroplasticity work? Can the brain really change? Oh, and thank you very much for the super hearts, all you folks. Oh, Camille, thank you so much. It's very generous of you. Good to see you, by the way. Jane Dope, thank you very much. Beth, I appreciate the super hearts. Oh, and Elizabeth, thank you so much for the super hearts. Always extremely generous. I hope all's well with you guys. And thank you, Time and Space, for the super hearts. Gosh, thanks, guys. Really nice of you. Okay, so can the brain really change, and how does neuroplasticity work? So first of all, can the brain really change? Absolutely. There are many times when I'm talking about a topic from addiction to post-traumatic stress disorder to concussions where I can't be 100% confident. I can't tell you with 100% certainty that this is the answer. I tell you with a bunch of caveats. That's how scientists speak. That's how scientists think of the world. But can the brain change itself? I can tell you with 100% certainty that yes, it can. And in fact, it must. And in fact, you have no choice in the matter. Everything you do will influence how your brain adapts, how your brain continues developing well into adulthood. And it does this, as you highlight, via a mechanism that we refer to as neuroplasticity. So that is a sort of a broad term that encompasses a lot of different domains of change that happen in the brain. And so probably one of the most intuitive is the creation and elimination of synapses. Synapses are sort of the point of communication between two neurons, between two cells. Think of it as when you're talking to somebody, you're not like face to face up against them talking to them. And if you are, you should probably adjust your conversation strategies. Think of it as a space between your faces, right? There's a little bit of space there, and through that space, words can travel, and facial expressions and body gestures and so on. That's kind of like what a synapse is. The synapse is a space by which or through which neurotransmitters and various signaling molecules pass to influence other neurons, bind receptors, for example. And so the number of synapses connecting different parts of the brain is dynamic. It's changing all the time. Some areas have a little bit more dynamism than others, but yeah, that is a dynamic process. And broadly speaking, the more that two different brain regions or even two different neurons are communicating with one another, signaling between them is occurring, there tends to be a strengthening of those synaptic connections, facilitating continued communication between those neurons. And if two neurons start getting a little bit more quiet, they stop communicating with one another, that will tend to favor the elimination of synapses. That's just one domain of neuroplasticity. But as we highlighted with neurotransmitters traversing the synapse to bind neurotransmitter receptors, another domain of neuroplasticity is the number of receptors that are available for a neurotransmitter to bind. And this is, I think it's always the case for me, one of the most demonstrative examples of changing numbers of neurotransmitters influencing function and behavior and consciousness is addiction. So one of the ways that a person becomes dependent upon and addicted to a drug is the chronic presence of that drug, the persistent use of the drug and presence of the drug in the brain will tend to those drugs will bind neurotransmitter receptors, which will then result in altered numbers of neurotransmitter receptors that are available, sometimes prompting there to be more, or prompting upregulation is what we call it, or there to be more neurotransmitter receptors available, or a reduction. And addiction can correspond to both, right? So cocaine, for example, regular cocaine use can actually result in increased numbers of receptors for cocaine to bind, whereas other drugs will have the opposing effect. So you don't have to take drugs for that domain of neuroplasticity to be active. That's also just constantly happening as we move through our daily lives. And then, there are others. Certain proteins can be more or can be found at greater or lower levels depending upon your experiences and where you're looking in the brain. And so, fundamentally, the whole kind of premise of psychology, psychotherapy, psychiatry is to exploit the fact that the brain will adapt to its environment, will adapt to new stimulation, and feed it a certain form of stimulation, a certain package to try and intentionally cause neuroplasticity to occur in such a way that delivers a therapeutic effect, right? So if our brain never changed, if what we got is what we got when we were born, or shortly after we were born, after our brain hardened, and that was it, then there really would be very little hope that something like addiction therapy would be successful, or psychotherapy in general. So yeah, definitely changes. It's an area of ongoing research to understand the nitty-gritty mechanisms of neuroplasticity. But yes, for sure. Oh man, I've been going on this topic for too long, but if it comes up again, I will give you a specific example that was discovered by one of my favorite neuroscientists in the world, happens to also be a colleague of mine, Alexei Ostromov, who discovered how at least one of the mechanisms by which chronic stress, can predispose organisms to increase their intake of alcohol. And it's for anybody who studies neuroscience or any neuroscientist, it's very counterintuitive because it causes GABA receptors to become excitatory. Okay, great topic. Thanks for bringing it up. A relevant side note, you're now in dad mode with a jean shirt. How dare you? I purchased this shirt when I was the fluffy-tailed age of like 23 when I was living in Texas. So how dare you, sir? But then also, you're right. I am definitely in dad mode. Good to see you in here, Zaina. Hope all is well on your side. Okay, we have a caller. Let's do this. I believe... Ooh, gotta get my paper. I believe your name is Jonas. From where are you calling, Jonas? Are you there, Jonas?
Nigger!
Oh, cool. This will be great. Good one, Waffles.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's gross. Imagine living your life where, like, that is how you derive pleasure. It's like, ooh, I'm going to say a bad word. I'm going to say a really bad word. You're going to get so mad. That's the only way you can get attention. Imagine that's your life. Oof. Depressing. Hey, Muap, good to see you, man. Hope all's well with you. Would you hang out with Benjamin Franklin for a day? Absolutely. Are you kidding me? For sure. All right. He's teasing you. No kidding. From Austin. I was in Houston. I can take it back. Hey, Leonardo. Good to see you. I will respond. So I've already written my response to you. But I just wanted to make sure it wasn't going to be all one-sided. GABA. We can talk about GABA. GABA is a big topic. GABA is the nervous system's principal inhibitory neurotransmitter synthesized from the nervous system's principal excitatory neurotransmitter, glutamate. A lot of people don't know that. And you can't eat GABA and expect it to get into the brain at very high levels at all. The brain has to synthesize its own GABA. So anytime you walk into a supplement store or like the grocery store these days and you see a supplement that says like calm or sleep and all it has is GABA in it, turn the other cheek. That will do almost nothing. At least it certainly won't make you more tired. All right. Is it true that walnuts are good for the brain because they resemble a brain? You know, I've heard this like dietary strategy of like eating things that look like the brain because they're good for the brain. That is generally speaking not a great strategy. I can show you, for example, some coral that I have on my bookshelf that looks very much like a brain, but if you were to eat it, you'd have some very substantial, at least gastrointestinal discomfort. But no, walnuts are good. Nuts in general are a component of the most regularly recommended diet for longevity, the Mediterranean diet or the MIND diet. But seeds and nuts in general as snacks, they don't have to look like the brain, are healthy. But so it's not because they look like the brain, though. All right. It's my pleasure, VIP Reality. All right. Do you support the amyloid hypothesis? So, Scarlord, I assume you're referring to the amyloid hypothesis of Alzheimer's disease. And that stipulates that it is the accumulation of amyloid beta plaques that is the sort of, if not the first, one of the most important and initial dominoes in the cascade that then causes the development of Alzheimer's disease. And so, you know, let's say 5 or 10 years ago, it would be very unusual for somebody to suggest, well, it wouldn't be very unusual, but it wouldn't be very common for a neuroscientist to suggest, no, I don't think that the amyloid beta hypothesis of Alzheimer's disease is correct. You know, more than 10 years ago, let's say. And it still remains the sort of the reigning hypothesis. But a couple of events in recent years have suggested that while, of course, amyloid beta plaques are very important. Well, let's step back. So Alzheimer's disease is the leading cause of dementia. It is just one cause of dementia, but it is the most common. And it is uniquely associated with two specific biochemical signatures, and that is the accumulation of amyloid beta plaques and the accumulation of neurofibrillary tangles. The tangles are inside of neurons, the plaques are outside of neurons. You can't have Alzheimer's disease without both of those things. And we know a lot about amyloid beta plaques. We know a lot about neurofibrillary tangles, not quite as much because not as many people have studied them. And it's not just because neuroscientists, they don't care about neurofibrillary tangles. It's that it's actually really hard to do neuroscience or to conduct experiments specifically on NFTs because it's really hard to get an animal to make them. It's actually really hard to have an animal make both, which is interesting and a topic of study all of its own. Like, why is it that mice just don't make both at the same time? Recently, however, there is a transgenic mouse that one can work with that does have both. But as a result, some of the earliest stages of research have been very difficult to conduct with the same level of rigor that, other, disease states are studied. So, okay. So the events that have highlighted some of the arguments that people who were the opposition of the amyloid hypothesis of Alzheimer's were that there have now been two main clinical trials that attempted and to some degree successfully cleared away amyloid beta plaques in the brains of people who were diagnosed with dementia and very likely Alzheimer's disease. And they were able to show that after their treatment, the load of amyloid beta plaques was reduced. And of course, the expectation, as the amyloid hypothesis of Alzheimer's disease would stipulate, would be that their symptoms of dementia would abate because, hey, the plaques are reducing in their density or in their load. And so if that's what's causing the symptoms of dementia, well, then so should the symptoms of dementia abate or be lessened. And these clinical trials were unsuccessful. The first one was unsuccessful in part because the treatment caused an immunological reaction. So some people had pretty substantial fevers and so on. This most recent trial didn't suffer from those side effects or adverse events. But despite that, they still didn't successfully reduce the symptoms of dementia. And so, I think certainly the majority of Alzheimer's researchers with whom I've spoken, I almost devoted my thesis to Alzheimer's disease, and I almost joined an Alzheimer's lab. The majority of them would always say that, it's more complicated than just one thing. Just like, depression is more complicated than just what serotonin levels are like, right? But, hey, there are two very specific things about Alzheimer's disease that are distinct from other conditions. That is amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. And so I think it was surprising to a lot of people that at least the first time it was unsuccessful. I know a lot of people were not surprised that this second clinical trial, I believe that was conducted by Eli Lilly, was unsuccessful. And so, there's something more complicated going on there. Another complication, for example, is that people can have amyloid beta plaques and not have dementia. And so it's clearly just not so simple, as is the case with a lot of things in the brain. And so, studying a bit more of the initial biochemistry and genetics that underlie dementia will probably reveal some new opportunities to attack the condition with small molecules and stuff like that. And it unfortunately won't be so simple as just get rid of the plaques, get rid of the disease. Okay. Hey, Brian. My name is not Brian. It's close, though. Okay. Well, we can see this guy's face, so we'll know who to blame. Okay, so Reb on Perry. Is your name Reb? Reb, is that your name?
Hello.
Hi.
Ian, how you doing?
I'm good. Where are you calling from?
I'm calling from the UK.
Oh, very cool.
From a place called... Yeah, from the UK. I have a question, actually, which I think you'll be the best person to answer.
I'll do my best.
Have you heard of transcendental meditation?
Oh, certainly. Yeah. So transcendental meditation, or TM as it's oftentimes referred to, is a form of, clearly you're aware, but is a form of mindfulness meditation, which is a broader category of meditation practices. It's certainly something I've heard of, read about. What's on your mind?
Now, my question is, do you perform it yourself? And if so, how do you go about performing it in your own time?
Right. So I don't specifically do transcendental meditation. I took a class that instructed mindfulness meditation more broadly. And, it's not like this is only available at my institution, University of Pennsylvania. A lot of psychologists and psychiatrists are doing sort of like what judo did to jiu-jitsu, mindfulness meditation does to transcendental meditation. And basically it's just, honing in on what we think are specifically the most beneficial aspects of mindfulness meditation that transcendental meditation teaches. I'm no expert on the, specific features of TM that distinguish it from other meditation practices. But what I do would just be called mindfulness meditation. How I used to do it a lot more. I don't have quite as much time as I used to. But what I would do is I was never able to do it very successfully without some sort of auditory guide. And so there are a bunch that you can download. University of California, San Diego has one. A bunch of universities have one. Sam Harris has put one out where they just sort of guide you and help you to bring your mind away from going down any kind of like thought, spirals. And so I tend to do it for 10 to 15 minutes. I know some people will go much longer than that, or some people start with just a couple minutes. And I try to do it, what I used to do is I would have a specific time during the day where I would go to a particularly beautiful part of campus and do it there on my own. But now I don't really have the opportunity to like just take that trip. And so I'll tend to do it when I'm like performing an experiment and I have some waiting time, or when I'm at home and I'm reading or writing, and I'll just take it as a break basically. But yeah, that's my strategy. And I'm a big advocate. But what about you? Do you practice TM?
Well, I've just recently got into it, but I know how expensive it is, and I don't have the money to invest in it. So I was just trying to see if I could, like, kind of shortcut my way through it, and just to find other people who've either paid for it and invested their time and energy into it so they can teach me, and then I'm able to learn it myself without having to spend a heck of a lot of money for it.
Right, yeah. Well, first of all, 100%. Yeah, you should not have to spend money to learn how to do mindfulness meditation. The class was beneficial in that it was led by a professor of psychology, and she was very educated on meditation and psychology in general, obviously. But there are plenty of free resources out there. And from my perspective, so long as you have a good guided, auditory track that you can listen to, and oftentimes these resources will also have the same kind of literature that I would have had, taking this class, where it just sort of like tells you what's the goal here, why are we doing this, what are the purported benefits, and what to do. For some people, mindfulness meditation can be very anxiogenic, and I've told this story before, so I'll truncate it here. There was a guy who we all introduced ourselves. He said, "I'm an anxious guy," and on the I think the third class, he broke out in tears and had to leave. He was like really perturbed by the experience, and we're just sitting there meditating. And so everybody's a little bit different. So if you happen to be somebody like that, it might be beneficial to seek out some kind of therapist or psychotherapist. But from my perspective, I wish I had them handy, but I'm almost certain it's University of California, San Diego has like a whole bunch of resources that are totally free that'll definitely deliver the active ingredient, in my opinion, the active ingredient of mindfulness meditation without the sort of pseudo-cultish components that some of these other practices have.
And it's absolutely free. The University of California, San Diego will provide me with very free resources.
100%. Yeah, 100% free. That's the whole point. Yeah.
And where is it under? Which tab do I go under? If that makes sense?
I would just search Google. I mean, I know I found it through Google because after the class, I knew I wanted some kind of auditory guided mindfulness thing to listen to while I'm meditating. I mean, I know for certain that Sam Harris, I don't know if you know who he is, and despite what you may or may not think about him as a person or him as a writer and stuff, his guided meditation is fine. I mean, it's just great. It has nothing to do with politics or anything like that, religion or anything. And it's freely available on his podcast. So at a bare minimum, you could go there. And I think he has like a 15-minute one and a 20, maybe a 30-minute one. But I'm almost certain, and my memory is an ailing component of my consciousness these days, but I'm almost certain that just if you go to Google, UCSD mindfulness meditation, I'm sure it won't be too arduous a journey to get to their free resources, but they're 100% free for sure.
Amazing. Ian, that's amazing. It's a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you very much for that information. And I hope to follow you, man, and see you. If I've got any other questions, I'll be sure to speak to you about them.
It was my pleasure, man. Thanks a lot for calling in.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
You too. I'm just another human. Clutch, as always, uclahealth.org, mark mindfulness meditation. So it was UCLA, of course. It wasn't UCSD. Unsurprising that UCLA is also a great institution for neuroscience, by the way. What a nice guy. No kidding. Just Google, I liked some from Dartmouth. I mean, I know that just happens to be the one that I'm familiar with. Well, somewhat familiar with, UCLA. But yeah, there's a bunch. I mean, and it doesn't have to be affiliated with the university necessarily, although you do have the advantage that you have the sort of institutional, review processes that have to occur there. Okay, can you make marijuana legal? I personally cannot, at least not today. But I would, absolutely. And I wouldn't just decriminalize it. I would legalize it and then tax it, just like any other recreationally used substance, like alcohol or tobacco. Of course, cannabis is in a slightly different category than certainly alcohol or tobacco, in that it does have some clinical benefits. So that, I think, is a completely different conversation to be had. Different sort of compensation or payment modalities should exist for those folks, people with, for example, treatment-resistant epilepsy, or it's been shown to be beneficial for some folks with PTSD, some folks with chronic pain. And so that's a different category than just recreational use. But I also think recreational use should just be totally legal. If we're basing our drug laws on public health, which I would submit to you we ought to, then there's really no rational explanation for allowing adults to make the decision as to whether or not they want to drink alcohol or smoke cigarettes, but forbidding them from smoking cannabis or vaporizing cannabis. There's just no logical explanation there. But of course, there's a huge institutional hurdle that there's a massive component of our federal government that is essentially funded by and based upon the prohibition of cannabis. That I think even for politicians who are right on this issue, at least from my perspective, it's probably just extremely difficult to overcome even that, despite the fact that the majority of the country is in favor of at least legalizing medical marijuana. Are you from Penn State? We have mutual connections on LinkedIn. Oh, no way. I am from the University of Pennsylvania. But I befriended some folks from Penn State who are interested in science policy a couple years ago. It's a beautiful part of the state, College Station. It's also a very confusing name for a town, College Station. I took a bus there. Did I take a bus? I took a train there. And I was like, okay, yeah, I'm at College Station. Okay, but where is the city? So that's where my mind was at. You can write tons from lots of universities. Thank you very much. I'm assuming you're referring to mindfulness meditation. Music education in childhood develops the brain, and the child will be better in math and logic. Why? Super interesting topic. Not a fully answered question. But to begin, there are certainly some similarities between language processing and music processing in the brain. There are, of course, distinctions. And then, of course, anybody who's taken any piano lessons or who's had parents who are math-minded will emphasize the role that mathematics can play in understanding music theory and understanding the relationships between different tones. There is this interesting theory behind why it is that certain note combinations sound sad versus sound happy. This theory has been abandoned, by the way, just so you know. But the theory was that if you move closer and closer together, and you move essentially from a third to a second, or just two adjacent notes, it becomes more and more difficult for the brain to distinguish those tones, and so it therefore has to exert more metabolic effort to distinguish these tones. And so that the theory is unpleasant. And so therefore it sounds sad. That theory has been abandoned because those same chords that might sound sad to an American ear or European ear cannot sound sad at all, have no emotional valence resembling sadness to a Middle Eastern ear or a Chinese ear or whatever. So but in any case, it's just an example. I should say, so the theory also stipulated that not only was it more difficult to distinguish the notes, but the sort of the numerical relationship between these notes, the fractions became more and more repeating, right? It wasn't just a nice clean number, and so that was unpleasant to the brain, which again, totally abandoned. There have certainly been studies that suggest that early music education is beneficial for educational outcomes later on in life. It is definitely something I'm doing with my daughter. I play the guitar for her almost every day. For a while, it was literally every day, and I usually play at least the same 2 songs, and in sometimes I even sing. But what's remarkable is that she definitely recognizes certain phrases within the songs, which is very cool. She'll like smile at the same time since it's the same point in the song. She's been doing that basically since she was like 3 months old at this point. And now she's almost 9 months old. Okay, so what is the mechanism of that benefit? I can't tell you for sure. I don't know that answer has been, that we have a solid answer to that question. But there's something to be said. There's also a benefit, for example, in learning multiple languages or spoken languages, in terms of like correlations with educational outcomes. And so, I've been to talks by cognitive neuroscientists who came up with the explanation that perhaps it has something to do with enabling the brain to have multiple strategies to express itself or to express some kind of internal state. And, English is great, but of course it doesn't have all the same mechanisms of expression that Italian has, or Chinese certainly has, which I tried to learn many moons ago unsuccessfully. I know a couple words, but, and so, perhaps just having multiple strategies to solve the problem of expressing inner meaning may have a generalizable effect, where then the brain can deploy multiple strategies to solve unrelated, challenges that it encounters. But as far as I'm aware, that remains a hypothesis. So I can't tell you the specific mechanism. All right, that is very sweet. Yeah, I used to play for the girls as the girls fell asleep. Yeah, so my grandmother used to play the piano while he and his many siblings used to go to sleep as well. Yeah, I think there's something to it. If only, I just want to make sure she learns how to play a musical instrument. Although I don't think I'm going to let her. My parents didn't let me learn guitar first. They forced me to learn piano first, which I hated them for at the time. And they told me that I was going to stop hating them when I got older. And I was like, no, but I want to be cool. I want to play the guitar. I want to be in a band, which I did. But now I deeply regret not continuing to practice piano because it is a beautiful, more complicated instrument. You wear fatherhood well. You seem very happy. Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, we're also very fortunate in that, my wife is able, at least sometimes, to work from home. I'm also writing a lot, and figuring out what I'm going to do professionally later. And so I can work from home a lot. And like just during this stage, like it is every day she has like a new superpower. It is so wild. And like, okay, just really quick tangent, which, I assume most parents wouldn't be in the position to understand if they hadn't gone through neuroscience, which is early on when babies are developing, they have fingers, obviously, if there isn't some kind of developmental issue, but their manual dexterity is still developing, and it's very rudimentary early on. And so oftentimes what they'll do is they'll move all their fingers at the same time, right? And they're sort of like bad at things. They won't, and then eventually they come up with the pincer movement, and then their other fingers begin to become more dexterous. But having studied, motor control and, volitional control of movement and stuff like that, I know that what's happening there is the way that, like, for example, I can make like this hand motion is my brain is sending, okay, move all of the fingers at the same time. That's the original signal and so that would be like this, let's say. And then what happens at a different part of my nervous system that says, hey, you 3 fingers, or 3 fingers. When you get that signal to move, you don't move. Just let the other fingers move. And so then I'm able to do this, right? And so it's this really messy, complicated system that is our motor system. And that process is developing. I'm like watching my daughter develop this capability in real time. So she can go from this to eventually this. Yeah. It's amazing to me that tardigrades have fingers, and no kidding, yeah, tardigrades are pretty cool. By the way, great to see you, Daryl. Hope all is well with you. Give him an anatomy PhD. Double for I didn't know you were in here. Awesome to see you, man. Babies have fingers. Yes, indeed. The first year of life is so awesome. Yeah, and particularly this period, you know, like you have the baby and you go home with the baby and like you're like, how did somebody let me do this? This is insane. Where's the instruction manual? Nobody gives you an instruction manual. But you're like, this is the cutest thing I've ever seen in my life. I would do anything for this cute little wrinkly potato. But then months go by and, you know, you're taking pictures. I have so many pictures. I have no idea what to do with them. And then you, like I did 2 nights ago, you look back at those pictures you took when, you know, the baby was like a month old, a couple weeks old, and you're like, not cute. Not cute compared to the modern you. So it's like an interesting trick in the primate brain that occurs to enable us to devote irrational sums of attention and sleepless nights to this wrinkly, very time-demanding potato. All right. No doubt foreign language is hard. Yeah, it was for me. Play Modern Warfare with me. You know, I would be so bad in those games now. I mean, not only because I'm like in my 30s now, my reaction time is like, you know, it's going to be so much slower, but like I was never very good at first person shooters. And so I would just be like, you could tell jokes about me. That would be fun. But I am planning on playing when Cyberpunk comes out. I'm definitely planning on playing that. Can't wait. Cregan, please don't say that. Oh, sorry, I missed that. All right. Cute little wrinkly potato is the greatest thing I've ever heard describe a baby. That's totally what she is. What is a brain scientist? Well, it's funny that you have brain in quotes, but a brain scientist is what we call in the United States a neuroscientist. Most countries call it a neuroscientist, but I think a lot of people who have never met, well, at least I know for sure because they've told me, a lot of people who have never met a scientist, let alone a neuroscientist, they wouldn't understand what a neuroscientist is and oftentimes confuse it with a neurologist or a neurosurgeon. Very frequently thinking that neurologists and neurosurgeons are a neuroscientist, and they're not. Very different training. I mean, it's more similar than, you know, an art historian, but different training. And so a brain scientist is what a neuroscientist is, at least most or many neuroscientists. Some neuroscientists also study things outside of the brain, but it's less interesting always. I'm kidding, but only kind of. And so a brain scientist or neuroscientist uses the scientific method to make observations about how the nervous system operates, exploit the work of others or the past discoveries of other neuroscientists, and ask new questions about how the nervous system does what it does. And, you know, because the nervous system does so much or encodes so much of who we are, you can ask a lot of really complicated questions like, what is synesthesia? How do we experience synesthesia? Why do we have emotion? What is the purpose of emotion? What does it do for us? How is something as nuanced and variable as emotion encoded in this super messy, complicated 3-pound mass? So yeah, we use the scientific method and then we conduct experiments to try and reject the null hypothesis. Which is, I mean, that is technically what we are attempting to do with our experiments, right? We're trying to disprove, essentially, our hypothesis about what's going on. But really what we're trying to do is conduct experiments to try and answer questions about how the nervous system works. That's a neuroscientist, different from a neurologist and a neurosurgeon. What is my favorite beer? My favorite beer is Roquefort 10 or Rochefort 10. I'm sure if Camila's still in here, she's cringing with my pronunciation of it, but it is a Belgian Trappist ale. I think it's the best beer in the world. But I love the Belgian Trappist style of beer. In fact, I have, you know, what's funny is like several years ago, I bought for myself and then people gave me gifts of, you know, the larger size, like wine bottle sized Belgian Trappist ales. And what's nice about this type of beer, for all my fellow beer nerds, is that you can cellar them. You can just save them for a long time, which you don't really want to do with like an IPA, for example. But now, so, you know, but I never have the chance to sit down and like drink a huge bottle of beer. My wife, you know, doesn't have remotely close to the tolerance to be able to have more than like 3 sips of a, you know, Roquefort 10, which is like almost as strong as wine. So I have this like these ancient bottles now at this point, many years old bottles of Trappist ales. Now, in the U.S., my favorite, I think Pennsylvania has some of the best breweries in the world. Victory is a great brewery. Weyerbacher, I think, is one of the unsung heroes of the sort of craft brew world, because they never just dove into the IPA bitterness battle that just made all beer terrible. Heady Topper, I think, is the best IPA. Well, it's certainly the best IPA I've ever had. I have a couple cans of that. But I should say, I am not a beer snob. Equal opportunity when it comes to beer. Natty Ice, Budweiser, Miller, they all have their purpose, particularly if you're having like a pool party. There's nothing better. So don't mistake me for some kind of snob. Is playing music beneficial to a stroke patient? That's interesting. I mean, so is it beneficial? I mean, I guess it really depends on how you're qualifying beneficial, right? Like, is it going to protect them from ischemia? Probably not, right? So ischemia is sort of like the mechanism of damage of a stroke. A stroke, for anybody that's not familiar, is something happens, right? Like an artery gets blocked, or an artery can rupture, and the arteries are what deliver blood to different parts of the body, including the brain. And if it fails to continue delivering blood to neurons, they will very rapidly begin dying. And depending upon the size of the area of the brain that is deprived of blood delivery, you will get more or less severe symptoms of stroke. And so, Thumper, what's up, man? I think, man. Actually, I'm not sure. Good to see you again, Thumper, though. And by the way, I should say... no, Beth. Okay, yeah. Thank you for the super hearts. I feel like there's a new person who is giving super hearts. Yeah, Stars and Dreams. Thanks for the super hearts. I really appreciate it. It's really nice of you. Right. So that is the mechanism of damage to the brain that occurs during and after a stroke. Now, the recovery from a stroke is a complicated process. It is not just protecting against subsequent strokes, which is very important, right? Because when one occurs, it can very well be the case that a subsequent one can occur. But it's also, you're sort of in a race to deliver as much effective therapeutic intervention as possible before things like gliosis occur, before the opportunity to form new synaptic connections becomes encumbered or inhibited by glial cells, essentially. And so, playing music, any kind of stimulation, really, just like, giving the brain new things to do. And depending upon where in the brain the stroke occurred, you can have different disruption of function, right? Oftentimes, I think most of us associate stroke with motor deficiencies, right? So people can lose the ability to walk, or parts of their body can become paralyzed. And so, obviously, you're going to be honing in on motor treatment, right? You're trying to help them to regain the synaptic connectivity that underlies their ability to move. You're essentially teaching the brain to walk again or to move again. But I think that there's something to be said from personal experience. There's something to be said for providing the person in recovery with an environment that fosters recovery, right? So they're not just, sitting there wasting away, feeling isolated, feeling abandoned, when they're sort of in a battle to recover lost function. And if music is a part of that, I'm all for it. But I would never replace any other kind of therapy with music. So, yeah. Mario Kart or Mario Party, I grew up with Mario Kart. But Super Smash Bros., if I'm being totally honest. Champion. I was total champion in college. Hours of misspent college time. Okay. You look like an idiot. Well, I get that a lot. And it's not for me to say whether or not I am an idiot. But so far, I've been able to make it this far. And so, but thank you for your input. I will take it under advisement. Thank you for the congratulations. I appreciate it. Natty Ice. Read the other day, after death, your brain lives or functions another 10 minutes. Myth, there must be something that was high visibility that came out, because somebody asked that question last Sunday. Like how long do you stay alive after somebody is dead is sort of how it was phrased. And it's worth noting that there are sort of like different. A physician would consider somebody to be dead at a different time than I think many of us would. So just to get more specific, right? If somebody ceases having brain activity and they don't have life support or something like that sustaining their life, they're not going to be conscious, right? The very engine of consciousness is turned off, and so they can still be technically alive. But if you're considering being consciously aware as the important part of being alive, which you don't necessarily have to, but then if you have no higher level brain activity, then you're not going to be conscious. However, if we're talking about like a guillotine type situation where your head has been severed from your body, then you will be able to sustain consciousness. But one way that, and I can't tell you for sure, I've never had the misfortune of experiencing a decapitation, but what I would expect the experience would be like is sort of like if you've ever been in a pool or underwater and you were underwater for a little bit longer than you probably should have, and you're trying to get to the top as quickly as possible, and you start getting tunnel vision a little bit because you're not breathing. You get that tunnel vision, and it's like, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god. I bet it would be a lot like that, where your consciousness pretty rapidly begins to recede into a very limited portfolio of experience, very limited repertoire of conscious experiences. And even, your vision, I would imagine, like literally would begin to keyhole essentially. But then also, you would just, the diversity of your awareness would shrink. And so you'd only be consciously devoted to a handful of things, just, a few things. And then eventually, it would recede to, whatever happens next. So I can't tell you for sure that it's 10 minutes. I can tell you for sure that not very shortly after cessation of blood delivery to the brain, neurons begin to die like pretty quickly. And also generally speaking, so I can't tell you for sure it's 10 minutes. It will be a couple minutes though. All right. Trying to prove a thing in science is biased in itself a little bit. You can pronounce Belgian French as you want. Yeah. Okay. Thought you were going to say Stella Artois. It's a great beer. What's funny is I know a lot of Americans will refuse to say the full name of Stella. That is just the name of the beer is Stella, because what do you say? Stella Artois? Stella Artois? But do you want to really say Artois in America? Like, are you that guy? So that's a very stressful beer to drink. Fight or flight and osteocalcin. Have you seen the paper? No. Huh, interesting. I'll have to check that. I'm going to write it down. Osteocalcin. Yeah, calcin. Thank you, Camille. All right. I am addicted to porn. There are some people who would argue that is a bona fide addiction. There are definitely some addiction researchers who would suggest that that's slightly different. It might be more like a compulsion. But yeah. Okay, why do I get panic attack? Okay, yeah. Well, like the simplest answer or response to a topic like that is it is because a certain circuit within your brain is exhibiting unusually high levels of activity, and that circuit just happens to be devoted to what happens when you're greeted with a perceived threat. This is evolutionarily sculpted, right? And so these are survival mechanisms, very basic fundamental behavioral outputs, and it's related to fight or flight, as Camille just brought up, but not in the same context. And so that is why, right? Is that the sort of the gas pedal has been hit to pedal the metal on a fear response, and many animals exhibit this, right? So like even animals as simple as rodents will exhibit a sort of freeze response, which may or may not be homologous or comparable to a human panic attack, where if they are exposed to a stimulus that they perceive as extremely threatening, they will just not move, and the duration of them not moving can expand depending upon how severely they're reacting, and it is just an overwhelming level of a fear response where evasive or confrontational behaviors just aren't an option. So yeah. Now, okay, so why do some people develop panic attacks is an interesting topic. And it seems to be the case that some people are resilient for some reason against developing a phobia or PTSD, which can be associated with panic attacks. But why it is that some folks are predisposed and some aren't, it remains an unanswered question. All right, I have a question, sir, from Prince. I'll do my best, see if I have something like an answer. Can an infection of any kind around the head and neck show up on a contrast MRI? Joey likes jam. Can an infection of any kind? Well, the only way that it would show up on an MRI is if the infection was, first of all, a rather severe infection, and it caused some kind of anatomical change that would be identifiable by like a radiologist. And so that would have to be a very severe infection. So, not every infection would be capable of doing something like that. It'd have to be a pretty severe, life-threatening infection. Your walls are well decorated. It's because I live in a very small apartment, and I moved here from a much larger domicile in Texas, and so I have stuff on like almost every surface of the wall. You look too young to be a brain scientist. I'm not even gay. Well, I think you'd be surprised. I think I look very similar to a lot of the people in my neuroscience program. The popular conception of what a scientist looks like is not necessarily the most accurate. And so, by the way, the girls are back from their walk. Ah, there she is. You should definitely write a book. I'd definitely buy it. I would love to write a book. I have like 4 ideas for different books, but I don't really know how to do that. And in fact, I'm like trying to talk to people who do have experience in that world to see what I'm supposed to do. But yeah, I would love to do that. Sounds like the baby might be a little tired. She does this thing. Well, okay. How much brain do kids have? Well, so it's an interesting topic, right? Because if you were to look at the skull of my 8-month-old, it's much smaller than my skull. So I still have that on her, so there's just less room for all the neurons that will eventually grow, right? Or 86 billion. She doesn't have as many. And so part of her developing is literally growing new neurons. Most of the neurons that we end up having outside of the womb, the baby will sometimes cry laugh, which is very cute, are developed while the baby's still in the womb, while the fetus is still in the womb. And then very soon thereafter, there's like 250,000 new neurons that are growing every minute. Cutie. Right, so there's this very rapid expansion of the number of neurons that occur very early on in life. But it's also worth noting that, neurons also begin to die after birth. There's like this interesting... It's like an interesting expression of how evolution works, right? Evolution is a tinkerer is one of the quotes. My daughter's like staring at me. Where, the brain will grow in this way and then all of a sudden take a left turn because of this evolutionary quirk that we developed along our ancestry that then will cause this new anatomical change. And, some neurons will develop and then die away just because, this is a genetically regulated process. And so all of this to say, how many neurons do they have? Not as many as we have, but very rapidly they begin developing a ton. But the brain is not really done developing, depending on how you're characterizing that, until really your mid-20s. It's a little bit earlier for girls, but yeah, your brain is still developing in your 20s, which I think it was surprising to me. I assumed that it was basically done by 18. After all, I can do all these crazy things when I'm 18. But yeah, that's a great reason to try as much as you can to dissuade your kids from drinking alcohol, smoking pot when they're in high school, because their brain is literally still developing. That's what adults used to say to me, but I didn't think they really believed it. And I don't think they did either. But now I can say, hey, there's this study. See, your brain isn't hard yet. All right. DMV says brain still developing till about 25. Yeah, exactly. Mid-20s. So he said, "Yo, Dad, where's your keys?" Yeah, right. I know a pregnant woman whose baby has a smaller than normal cerebellum. Won't know damage till born. Yeah, that's right. And that's actually, it's an interesting phenomenon. There have been case studies of people who have been admitted to the hospital for just something, right? They had some kind of injury that prompted a brain scan, and it turns out they don't have a cerebellum. And they had no idea. Like that never came up before until they were like an adult and they, got into a car accident and had to get an MRI, and then they have no cerebellum. The cerebellum is a really interesting part of the brain. It's very, very ancient. Mice have a cerebellum, for example. It's extraordinarily dense. Generally speaking, the cerebellum is most closely associated, just like when you're learning about the brain, most closely associated with motor regulation. And it helps to sort of refine movement to, make them a little bit more just smoother. Also important for also implicated in things like keeping rhythm. As I'm snapping my fingers, there are a bunch of neurons in my cerebellum that are firing at the same time, right? And these neurons in the cerebellum are very densely interconnected. They have a unique morphology, anatomy, that enables them to activate each other extremely efficiently. So it's a unique part of the brain. It's also involved in things that don't have to do with locomotor activation, but it's not, I've never seen any studies that point to it as like the mediator of creativity or the mediator of memory, certainly, or the mediator of mood, although it has been implicated in all these things. It's the kind of thing where, you'll pay, certainly if there is a cerebellum, but it just happens to be a little bit smaller than a pediatric neurologist might expect, a neonatologist might expect. It'll be the kind of thing where I wouldn't be super concerned. It's just the kind of thing that you're going to want to pay attention to, continue paying attention to. And, just always have that as a part of like the conversations that you have with pediatricians. Otherwise, it could just very well be the case that you wouldn't even know that, had this, I'm sure it was detected on like a ultrasound or sonogram or something like that. Had they not picked that up, you might not have known. So yeah. And also, it is also worth noting that like the emotional states of a pregnant mother have ramifications for the development of the fetus. And so, anything you can do to sort of like maintain a sort of calm, just sort of calm inner experience, which I know is extremely easy for me to say, much more difficult for a pregnant woman to instantiate. But if, that is also therapeutic. All right. Why don't I have any memory of visiting a speech doctor visits when I was younger? I don't smoke. I rarely drink. So it would depend on the age, right? We of course can't, the vast majority of us can't remember every aspect of our childhood. In fact, that might be rather torturous if you think about all the negative experiences that you have when you're a kid, which we tend to remember a little bit more efficiently than we do other things. But, unless there was something remarkable about those experiences, I wouldn't necessarily anticipate somebody to remember the nitty gritty details of something like that. I mean, I know I had one piano teacher and then a second piano teacher when the first piano teacher had to move. And like, the only reason I bring this up is that it's like a, periodic introduction to an adult that wasn't part of my family, which is kind of like a speech therapist, right? And I remember just very short, very snapshots, right? Flashbulb memories is what we call them, of those, months and months and months of experience. So, it doesn't, not necessarily indicative of something wrong with your brain. So yeah, I'm not quite sure why this would be causing you concern. How does it feel to have an IQ of 245 among us peasants? I 100% guarantee you that I do not have something like that. And I 99% guarantee that my IQ is no higher than the average. I have no reason to suspect that it is. I've never performed at an exceedingly unusually preternaturally high level academically or cognitively. It is a misperception because I get to study this thing that not a lot of people study, and not a lot of people therefore know about it. And it's a privilege, but it comes across as like, oh my gosh, he has all this knowledge about this. It's my job to have knowledge about this stuff, right? So don't get it twisted. I'm not any smarter than you. This is not knowledge that is only available to brilliant geniuses. That's what I used to think about scientists, by the way, until I met them, and then, oh my god. No, I mean, there are of course some truly brilliant scientists that I've been able to meet and work with, but by and large, scientists are just people who have a unique interest in a subject. You have to be very interested in the subject, passionately interested, but they're not more brilliant than any other field, really. All right. Is there a way we can train our brains to help prevent dementia and Alzheimer's? It's an interesting question. And in fact, because it's been so difficult to come up with effective cures and effective treatments for dementia and Alzheimer's, there has been a sort of an increasing interest in lifestyle interventions to either stave off the onset of dementia or ameliorate the severity of the symptoms. And so, yeah, there are a couple things that have been shown to be correlated with reduced speed of decline, like a delayed onset of dementia. And so these are things like avoiding being socially isolated, which can happen in various societies, certainly in the United States, as somebody gets older, and they can no longer socialize in the ways that they did, or maybe they never really socialized all that much. That is associated with increased severity of dementia, earlier onset of dementia. Cardiovascular exercise. So I'm forgetting the frequency. It was something like, it's not like this is a magical number. It's just so happens to be what they found. Something like 20 minutes of moderate intensity cardiovascular exercise, 3 to 4 times a week. And so that can be, depending on your age, moderate exercise, cardiovascular exercise is more or less kind of aggressive. But it can just be like a jog, a walk, bike ride, anything that elevates your cardiovascular rhythm for, a sustained period of time. That is associated with the reduced onset of dementia. Avoiding diets that are very high in simple carbohydrates, sugar in other words, which can be kind of tough in the United States, but sticking more to lean proteins, leafy green vegetables, seeds and nuts as snacks. The Mediterranean diet calls for a glass of red wine every now and then, but the Mind diet does not. And in fact, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that there's really no amount of alcohol that is certainly beneficial, but then even benign. Just in terms of like biological health. So those 3 things. Yeah. Another one is it's what we call continued education or not continued education. Educational attainment is sort of like a shorthand that epidemiologists and neuroscientists will use to identify a cohort of people who have continued on in a cognitively challenging environment. Right, you've continued your education for a bit longer than other folks, right? And the reason that it's handy is that if you're in an academic institution or you're pursuing some kind of degree, like a PhD or a master's degree or a bachelor's degree, right? You're being challenged to cognitively perform on tasks in a way that people outside of educational institutions absolutely can, but it's hard to quantify that, right? So it's hard to find people who do that outside of educational attainment, right? So all of this to say that continuing to challenge yourself cognitively has been shown to be beneficial in staving off the onset of dementia. So those 4 things have been consistently associated with just beneficial effects in terms of cognitive health and longevity. A dietary thing that has been pretty consistently identified as beneficial is turmeric. Curcumin in turmeric seems to be associated with some kind of benefits for dementia. So cook with turmeric every now and then. Have yourself some curry. All right. Need to sit on a park bench or bench at a mall and talk to people and drink wine. Avoid dementia. Well, no, yeah. I mean, socially interact. Totally. We are primates, right? We're social primates. And that is, a lot of our brain is devoted to social interaction, social evaluation, social cooperation. In fact, there is, one sort of evolutionary biology argument that the reason we have this big fancy brain and this big fat neocortex is because we had to cooperate evolutionarily in societies to get enough food to live. We weren't as fast as, the predatory cats. We're not as strong as other primates like chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, but we have a comparatively much higher endurance, and we were able to cooperate socially in more complicated ways so that we were able to basically outsmart other animals and develop, more sophisticated, agricultural techniques and stuff like that. So, yeah, I mean, social interaction, sitting on a park bench talking to strangers, I don't know if that's like the kind of social interaction that you want, but hey, it's one. Take some dance classes or, whatever, just, environments that foster social interaction that is unpredictable and, engaging is recommended. Red wine cures anything. All right. Every person I met with dementia were heavy drinkers. I mean, it's interesting. I haven't seen a study that specifically focuses on the effects of, let's just say, moderate drinking. Heavy alcohol consumption is associated with a variety of maladies, right? And brain health is just one. But and so I don't think anybody would be surprised that there would be some kind of negative health outcome from heavy drinking. But let's just say moderate drinking. I've not seen any epidemiological studies that have shown a specific effect on dementia. Now, it probably exists. I would be surprised if it didn't, because it'd be such an easy study to do. But I'll say this: I wouldn't be surprised if there is a correlation there. I just haven't seen it, so I hesitate to be like, yeah, for sure. Can't understand why vegans hate people that are not like them. Really, is that surprising to you? I'm surprised when there is a person who is a devotee of a given tribe of any kind. Veganism is just one of them, but political party certainly, sports team, scientific discipline. I'm always surprised when somebody is like humble and open-minded to other groups. Like that's surprising to me. It's very pleasant when I do my best to emulate that. I'm always surprised by that. So I'm always surprised when I meet a vegan who's like chill, like, oh yeah, you eat meat. I don't think you should. I think there's reasons that you shouldn't, but I don't. That's always like, whoa, I might start considering veganism. I better get on the treadmill. I'm already forgetting a lot at 35. Well, that begins to happen. I mean, and memory loss is totally natural, right? That is like not surprising, but there is a difference between, mild cognitive impairment and just the standard sort of minor cognitive deterioration that occurs to all of us, when you reach my age. It's really interesting how physical exercise can help keep a healthy brain. Oh yeah, for sure. And in fact, so I have a podcast. It's called Wired to be Weird on iTunes and Stitcher and so on. I think I might change the name soon. But not very much. And it's going to be about fasting. Okay, so this is, there are different kinds of fasting. You know what I realized I haven't done? Such a dummy. So there are different kinds of fasting, right? So there's like alternate day fasting. There's intermittent fasting, which is something I do. And there is, time restricted feeding, which is really intermittent fasting. Then there's like, the sort of fasting that's associated with certain religious traditions, like Ramadan, for example. And there's some really interesting biology that has revealed some potential substantial benefits of doing this. But then also, of course, diet and metabolism and exercise and, physical exertion are intimately associated with one another, right? One of the major reasons that we have to eat so much is to sustain physical activity. And so if you begin to study the relationship between, physical exertion and fasting, right? And being in a fasting state where you haven't eaten any food for several hours, particularly carbohydrates. And you begin to see the effect of what's called intermittent metabolic switching, where you're going from a glucose-derived metabolism or glucose-based metabolism to a ketone-based metabolism. There's some really interesting neurophysiological changes that can occur. And there's some evidence to suggest that it might be beneficial for things like longevity, cognitive health, and so on. So I'm doing that reading now, and it's taking me longer than I would have liked because I haven't put out a new podcast episode for a long time. But
I rest assured that I am working on that now. But it's a big topic, and I want to try and have it be as wide ranging and not like hone in on specifically, what's happening to, whatever, Krebs, so yeah, it's an interesting topic. I totally agree. All right, we found aliens. We found aliens at Area 51. Oh yeah, that was very cute. I'm too scared to see my doctor. I don't blame you. I get freaked out too. I'm more scared to see my dentist though. CBC oil or cod oil. If you didn't put that correction, I would assume you're interested in CBD oil. So yeah, cod liver oil, very interesting history behind cod liver oil. It is perhaps one of the main reasons that the Scandinavian Nordic countries, people from those societies were able to continue living, because of they are for a large part of the year bereft of sunlight. And we need sunlight. Without sunlight, we will not manufacture vitamin D in our skin, by our skin. And it just so happens that vitamin D is at surprisingly high levels in cod liver, and therefore cod liver oil. And so without that, they probably wouldn't have been able. They did actually. There have been discoveries of Viking remains and stuff like that, where they had all kinds of anatomical abnormalities, really thin leg bones, very diminutive height, which was sort of unusual for that group. They tend to be pretty tall. And there were other ones that I'm forgetting now, but there were a bunch of issues that arose from societies in that part of the world that didn't consume cod or cod liver oil. Now, of course, for the vast majority of us, the benefits of cod liver oil are not quite comparable to that of somebody living in that part of the world. And really, rather than vitamin D, generally speaking, people are interested in cod liver oil because they're interested in the omega fatty acids, omega-3 in particular, but then also omega-6 and 9. And these have been for a very long time now called like healthy fats, or they've been purported to be able to extend lifespan quite a bit, and sustain cognitive health and all these things, right? EPA and DHA have been implicated in retinal development for little babies. So for a very long time, of all of the supplements that people bring up, omega-3 fatty acids were the one where I was like, yeah, it's probably good for you. But there have been several very, very large studies of people who consume omega-3 fatty acids, and there just doesn't appear to be any significant benefit to health to consuming omega-3 fatty acids. So it remains the kind of thing where it's is it going to hurt you? Almost certainly not, because nobody's consuming enough omega-3 fatty acids to have a problem. But if you're on a restricted budget, like I certainly am, your money is probably better spent getting healthier food, spending more time, cooking for yourself, cooking whole foods for yourself, than, taking a supplement like omega-3 fatty acids. But it's probably not going to hurt. Lauric acid and coconut oil, good for you. Yeah, so that's slightly different. Hey, Clownykins, I feel like it's been a while. Good to see you. So that's different, right? So that's not a supplement. Coconut oil is interestingly unique in what it offers to our metabolism, because it has these medium chain triglycerides that can be burned on demand. What distinguishes the metabolism of a fat from a medium chain triglyceride is that, or I should say, what distinguishes the metabolism, how we break down fat from a carbohydrate, is that when you eat a carbohydrate, it's almost immediately available to be burned for energy, to make ATP. When you consume fat, it's not available for metabolism for a long time, because basically, I think my daughter is playing with those little springy doorstoppy things. I think she's playing with one of those. God, when you kick those after you've put her down to sleep, it's like the most dreadful sound in the world, because of course it wakes her up. So I've removed most of them, but okay. So yeah, you have to literally devote, you have to make micelles to basically wrap these fats up in a more digestible package, so that then you can break them down into ketone bodies to burn for energy. So it's a far less efficient source of energy. It is, however, more calorically dense, so you get more energy out per gram of fat, but it takes longer to break down. And that is excluding medium chain triglycerides. What makes it so difficult for us to break down most fat is that they're these long triglycerides. Triglycerides is a kind of fat, right? It just is fat. These long chains that we then have to like come up with all these metabolic tricks to break down. Medium chain triglycerides are much shorter, and so we can just burn them like that. So they're kind of more comparable to let's just say glucose metabolism. So yeah, that's different. And so particularly if you're doing something like a ketogenic diet, or probably a paleo diet, you get there a little bit. You can rely a lot more on ketones, on medium chain triglycerides and things like coconut oil than, for more sustained energy. Fats can be immediately available depending on the state of your physiology, ketogenic leptin. Well, no, so you're talking about a bunch of like metabolism regulatory hormones, right? But you do have to break down, if a fat is of a certain length, you have to break it down. Otherwise, it can't enter into certain ATP generating pathways. But yeah, that's not true for medium chain triglycerides. Unless there's some biochemical pathway I've never been exposed to. All right. You know what? I should probably get going. Yeah. Sorry, my clock is like obscured. So I have a podcast. It's called Wired to be Weird. It's on iTunes and Stitcher and Podcast Addict, which is what I've been using recently. And the next episode is going to be about fasting. I also have a Patreon, which I know not everybody's in a position to contribute to something like a Patreon, but if you are, I would deeply appreciate it. It is the thing that has enabled me to acquire a microphone like this one, which I'm obviously generating a bunch of dumb noise for the recording, but for your audiological pleasure. And so I am infinitely grateful to all of you for that. So my Patreon is patreon.com/anthropoid. And then also, if you're in a position to be able to contribute, and I'm always open to new ideas, but to try and offer some kind of reciprocity, I'm always happy to schedule some time where we can talk about some topic that you're interested in going deeper, into which you're interested in going deeper, and we can have a bit more of a comprehensive conversation on a topic than we're able to do in these settings, or that I don't cover in the podcast. So thank you all so much for hanging out. I appreciate it. I hope to see you same time, same place next Sunday. But if I don't, have a great Sunday. And until then, have a great beginning of your week. See you guys. And here's the awkward part of the YouTube where I'm still streaming live. So yeah, I know the YouTube is still very, very small. And I'm not quite sure what I should do with it that's distinct from the live interaction. Because, I don't really have the skills nor the time at the moment to create more better produced stuff. But if you have any ideas, I am all eyes and ears. Otherwise, I think it's just like, if some people like to interact with YouTube more than Twitter. So have a great week, everybody. Thanks for watching.